Well, good afternoon. I'm going to continue now doing chapter with the show for chapter 2 of the Do Ask, Do Tell, a Gay Conservative Lashes Back book. And the chapter is called Sputnik, the Draft, and the Proles. The Proles relates to an unpublished novel that I wrote in 1969 while I was in the Army, but I talk about it in the book. And again, I'll be referring to, this first book in this video. And I'm going to be talking about my experience in graduate school, and which started in February of 1966, went until I got my master's at the start of 1968, and then abruptly entered the Army and spent 2 years in the Army, which was quite a shocking contrast. And there's a little bit of a moral to the story, so let's get on with it. First, I'll just show you, I went to the University of Kansas, and that was because a friend had told me about assistantships there in the math department, which were actually quite common, but I didn't know that. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures. I've been there several times, numerous times since then, but these are some pictures from the state. I'll run through them. That's Lawrence, looking down downtown Lawrence. That's KU. That's Kansas City, Missouri. That's Kansas City Star. That's Lawrence again. That's the Granada Theater, the Varsity Theater. That's downtown Lawrence. That's the Campanile Tower. It's KU. That's Fraser Hall. That's Strong Hall, the math department. Those were the dorms, which are now torn down and replaced, I think. Again. And that's McCollum, where I lived. That's Topeka, Kansas. That's Westboro Baptist Church. That's a motel. And these are the Flint Hills, which are about 100 miles west, and a little more scenery. And that's pretty much for just a tour of Kansas. And we'll get on with the major picture show, with the major narrative of my graduate school in Kansas. It started, interestingly enough, right after the blizzard of '66 in Washington, D.C., which and in my life I've had very little trouble with flights, but the flight to St. Louis that then was supposed to go to Kansas City was canceled because of snow in St. Louis, actually, that February 1st. So I wound up flying to Chicago on a prop jet, and then to Kansas City, which only then had the little downtown airport. And this was a new phase in my life where I would fly a lot, and I hadn't before very much. And flying was very easy in those days, and it would be by and large until 9/11. I mean, you just didn't think very much of doing it, very much of it when you did it then. And that would be that way for 35 years. I would get to my dorm. I would get to my dorm room, to my dorm, which was in McCollum Hall, which this building has been replaced now, but it was on the 9th floor, and my room was actually on the back side, facing Iowa Street and looking west and looking onto to the prairie. About 9 o'clock Central Time in the evening, lost an hour, and which was good. And I'd have some time in the room to myself until a roommate arrived, and he would be kind of an earthy guy like the roommate of William and Mary, but now I knew to keep my mouth shut. So I didn't really have any problems very much, although there was one thing I'll get into later. He had been in the Peace Corps, and wanted a job later in the Peace Corps, but we'll get back to that later. Anyway, so this would be my first time living in a dorm again for 4 years after what had happened at William and Mary. Now, I didn't have a car, and for these 2 years I spent most of my time on campus, going back and forth by bus and walking. It was a little less than a mile to the main buildings of the campus across the athletic field. And sometimes walking downtown to downtown Lawrence is a little more than a mile probably. Once in a while to the movies or to do stuff, to go to church. Once in a while, taking a bus to Kansas City for one reason or another. And in fact, I'll even mention on the outset, I was already concerned about my future security clearance and everything, so I volunteered to take another draft physical, which I did in April of 1966 in Kansas City. I had to take a train into Kansas City and spend the night in a barracks to take the physical, and they would be classified 1Y after that. And at that point, the military was no longer asking about homosexual tendencies. So even then, in the middle 1960s, as Vietnam had up, you kind of had don't ask, don't tell already, and nobody was talking about it that way. It's very little known. But anyway, I signed up academically. I signed up for 9 hours. That was the normal for a graduate student. You were allowed to count some undergraduate students' courses with 100 numberings of it, but some of them had to be in 200 and 300 numberings. And I also continued organ because I had started taking organ from an 18-year-old organist at First Baptist Church back in the last year. That was another thing. I was trying to expand my music, again, my purposes and everything. By the way, I will just mention, I'll come back. I made a Harmon circle for this chapter, which is kind of wanting to have some power as an assistant instructor, and then going to grad school, and then you'll see what happens, and then you'll see what the crises are as I get into the Army. But we'll get back to, now I've got to find the picture. Here it is. Let's go back to Strong Hall, which was the math department right on the main street of the campus. One of the most conspicuous buildings in the campus. And it looked just like that in this is a picture from 2006, but it looked just like that in 1966. It just changed very little. And I actually, the first day of class, I think, was February the 6th, as I remember right that year. And I had 2 of my academic classes, but I'm going to talk about the teaching assistantship first. And that became an interesting narrative. I taught 2 sections of what they called Math 2A, remedial algebra. It was algebra for students who had not passed algebra in high school. And so they got the grade counted, but they had to take 3 more hours. It was a 3 and most of the students didn't understand abstraction. They had a hard time understanding the idea of even substituting numbers, solving for a symbol in an equation, and substituting numbers for it, or combining expressions and operations, like in math and algebra, you have groups and rings and fields and so forth, and then you have analysis, which would be my coursework. But students at this level don't understand the abstraction, and the schedule called for there to be 4 exams, and the first one was very early. It was in the 3rd week of class, February 23rd, I think, and there were 20 questions, and 5 of them were just to restate, like the distributive law and the commutative law and so forth, or just restate things. And they were like questions that would have been on tests when I took 9th grade algebra in junior high school myself. And the highest grade anybody got was 55 out of 100, so I added 45 points to everybody's grade, and then used a scale of 90, 80, 70, 60. And remember, in high school, the scale had been 95, 89, 81, 75. And it's hard to believe we survived in a world where your future depended on your grades so much, where grades were almost like a currency in a sense. And what would happen to you if you went in the military, for example, if you got drafted, if you were a male, depended on that. And how much emphasis it was so competitive, you know, is something that the left resents today, and probably quite rightfully so to some extent. But after the second test was more reasonable, but I got called in and I sort of stood my ground and maybe said some things I shouldn't have said. Didn't really that were a little bit insubordinate and I shouldn't have said, and I'll take the responsibility for it. But I went home, you know, for Easter break or spring break for about 6 days, and then came back, and on the 5th of April I was supposed to have a class, to teach a class, or I think I taught the Monday class, but on Tuesday morning, the Monday class was actually, one of the sections was actually in this building in a very nice classroom. The other one was in a Quonset behind near the Campanile Tower. And they had made an appointment for me to come to see the department head ahead of time, and I was directed into the department, and I was relieved of my duty as teacher for the rest of the semester. However, one student I had caught cheating on a test, on the second test, and when I saw him copying and noticed the similarity to another student's, and he admitted it. And he actually came up to my dorm room when I was in my underwear. It's kind of interesting. I had the hair on my legs then, at that age. And it's a really sensitive situation, given my background, and begged for mercy. And I'm sort of not someone who believes in second chances. So he wound up getting an F in the course, even though that was the only grade I gave. The new teacher honored that ruling by me, but then took over the rest of the course. I would get the assistantship back in the last semester there. But I'll just also talk in this portion of the video, I'll just talk about the academic load. Graduate school, it was harder than undergraduate. You would typically have hour examinations. You would typically, maybe you'd state a couple definitions or something, but you typically have to prove some theorems, particularly in analysis, prove some extra problems like homework problems, and put together maybe 2 theorems and then substitute something for something else and put some things together to solve a problem. And in 50 minutes, it's very hard to do that with very many problems. So the grades tended to be curved a lot. I remember in one class in mathematical analysis, which was technically an undergraduate course, my grades were 57, then 46, then 82 on the last one on vector spaces, and I got a 67 on the final, and that was a B. Now think about what that was like in high school when 95 was an A and you had to get 75 to pass, you know. And then the typical score was 90, 80, 70, 60 as an undergraduate at GW for a lot of courses. So that was kind of interesting. But I kind of pulled myself together and got 2 B's and an A. My music, I didn't keep up the organ that much. And then went home and worked at David Taylor Model Basin for the summer. And at this point, I'm going to move to another video and discuss the rest of my time as a graduate student, because there's some other issues that are interesting.